So we're going to start with Chelsea Rose. She's a historical archaeologist who focuses on the settlement and development of the American West. She's director of the Southern Oregon University Lab of Anthropology and principal investigator of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project, which has won the 2024 National Trust for Historic Preservation Advisory Council Federal Partnership Award, the 2022 National Leadership in History Award from the American Association of State and Local History, the 2020 Oregon Heritage Excellence Award, and the 2020 Bureau of Land Management Heritage Heroes Award. Rose regularly works with the media, students, and community volunteers in an effort to promote archaeological awareness and encourage historical stewardship. Chelsea's been featured in books and magazines promoting STEM education. She co-edited Chinese Diaspora Archaeology in North America with Ryan Kennedy and guest co-edited the Winter 2021 special issue of the Oregon Historical Quarterly about the Chinese diaspora in Oregon with Jennifer Fang. So thank you for coming to us with such an impressive background, and look forward to your talk.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. And for those of you who didn't get any archaeology yesterday, fear not, because we're going to go on an archaeological journey around Oregon. So I have so much I want to tell you, and I've had the opportunity, being on the last day, to tailor this talk a little bit based on what I've been hearing the last couple days. But really quickly, the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project is a multi-agency kind of grassroots organization and collaboration that does research, public history, and public archaeology across the state. You're going to be hearing a couple of their partners today, so I'm not going to talk too much about this collaboration, but basically you can see we've got federal agencies, universities, museums, historical societies. We also have tribes, and we also have some new partners that haven't been added up to this list yet. But we have a pretty ambitious goal, and that is, it was so thrilling to me to hear that there was a Rural Chinatowns conference, because in Oregon, we're pretty much all rural. I mean, I think people would maybe give us Portland as a city, but beyond that, it's all rural. And when you look at maps of Oregon and Chinese heritage in Oregon, a lot of times you see these very few dots: Portland, Astoria, John Day, and Jacksonville. And so when we started doing this work in 2016, we were kind of going after the obvious railroad sites, mining sites. But as we started to build collaborative partnerships, we realized this story is way bigger than we realized. In 2021, that Oregon Historical Quarterly volume, which has a lot of great stuff in it, I can tell folks how to get it if they're interested. But when they wanted to make a map, I said, oh, no, you can't use those maps. Let me try to cobble something together. So this was based on some data that we were putting together by that point, but I was like, this is still not accurate. And as you can see, there's huge swaths that are empty. And so we thought we might be able to put a few more pinholes in this map. Well, just recently I got a grant from the Oregon SHPO, the one that, like what we have Chris do, but in Oregon, that's doing a lot of great work too. And they said, hey, where do you want to spend this money? And I said, I want to spend a week going up the coast, because anecdotally, we know that there was a lot of Chinese American workers and communities there, but we don't have very many dots on the map. In 1 week, we created this map. These are all sites that had at least one cannery, which had a sizable population of Chinese American workers. So if I can add that many more dots in a week, it's really encouraging to see how many more sites with Chinese heritage we have in the state that we haven't yet been able to document. Going forward, these are the sites that we've been doing archaeology at so far, and I'm going to kind of quickly go through some of these. You can find out a lot more on our website about all of them. But again, we just recently got a really fantastic opportunity. Our Oregon Senator Merkley asked us if we had a project that he could put forward for congressionally directed spending. And we ended up getting $500,000 that we get to spend over the next 3 years. And so what we're going to do is target areas in those blank areas where we maybe don't have partners, or there's not folks that can hire us or find funds. We can go target these things where we want to dig. So just in starting to have conversations about what that could look like, we're going this summer to Baker City, so we're moving a little bit farther east. I just found out There was a Chinatown in Lakeview, so that was definitely a big blank area. We found out that there's borax miners down in this area with another Chinese community. So really everywhere we've looked in Oregon, we have found Chinese heritage, and that is so exciting. And so my hope is by the end of these 3 years, it's just going to be so many dots on the map, you won't be able to see Oregon anymore. And so now I just kind of go through some of the different things we've been doing to tell you the so what. You know, dots on the map are great, but what are we actually learning? Well, you know, my title talks about rural Oregonians, and so one of the things that we're looking at is the way that rural spaces, for those of us that live in rural spaces, a lot of times people kind of approach it with this idea of like, how did you survive? You know, it's harder there. And so, you know, sure, we don't always have access to, for me, concerts is what I'm most annoyed about. But, you know, stores, it's harder to get things are farther away. We don't have good airports. But we also have a lot of opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily have in an urban place. So, for example, this is Lung On. Most of you probably heard of the Kamwa Chung and Company in John Day. It's a state park and a really wonderful resource. Well, he was very well known in his community, entrepreneur, did all sorts of things. But he was able to leverage the relationships he built. And when he saw an opportunity, in this case, there was no car dealership. He started one. He started the first car dealership in Eastern Oregon, and he's one of the first, if not the first, I haven't heard the latest, Chinese-American man to open a car dealership in the US. So, you know, that was something that he did not despite being in a rural community, but because of it, because he could leverage those connections he made. He was a known person and he was smart and saw an opportunity. And there's lots of other examples like that. Also, a lot of times the way that Chinatowns, Chinese businesses are portrayed in these rural communities are as distinct or you know, within ethnic enclaves or not really as relevant to the larger community. And again, in John Day, that's not the case. As the demographics changed, the Kamwa Chung and Company were smart. They, again, saw opportunities. They shifted what they sold in the stores. They didn't have as many Chinese American miners, but they still had a large community that needed stuff. And there's a lot of oral history accounts that almost makes it sound like they were the first Costco. You could buy bulk stuff and barrels of things. And so people would go, you know, seasonally and load up on supplies. And that was really, you know, helpful for the larger community. And in addition, they've got a sign up top there you can see here. Now the NRA people associate with guns, but it was the National Recovery Administration. So this is a post-Depression era voluntary thing you could join to make a commitment to your community that you could find goods at fair prices. So this is really literally signaling that they are part of the community, they're patriotic, and they're actively, you know, trying to be a resource for their larger community. Again, a lot of the sites we've been working at across Oregon, we've been focusing on merchant stores. One of the articles you can read in one of those things is about how merchant stores, sure, they sold stuff, but really the bigger value that they added to these small rural towns was the access to privilege status of a merchant, which helped you bring your family over, helped you maybe go visit, you know, your home village and come back. And so all of these men and others, these are just the 3 examples I have, you could be a partner in one of these stores, or you could be a paper merchant. So you could get partnership papers for the time to help you navigate, you know, the immigration issues, whatever you were dealing with. And so just one man here in the middle, Wang Quan Su, he is in Ashland. He helps like 24 people come over to the Ashland area from one village in China. And that is something, that role, that service he provided is something that the larger white community had no idea about. They just thought he sold stuff. And in reality, these men and many others like them were engaged in a sophisticated counterattack against this racist immigration system. And that's something that, again, instead of talking about what happened to these people in the, you know, in the ways of all the laws and stuff, but talking about their stories and the way they navigated the world and the circumstances that they were facing. One other really cool thing, who knew there was Chinese cowboys in Oregon? This has been one of my favorite kind of threads to unravel. Grant County, which is where John Day is, and the Kamwachang, still ranching is a really critical part of that community identity. A lot of like 100-plus-year-old ranches. A lot of those ranches that are still there today had early on Chinese American cooks, sheep herders, buckaroos, even foremen on these ranches. There is even today a ranch and rodeo museum in John Day, which has a fantastic room with rodeo queen outfits, but very little information about the Chinese American ranch hands and cowboys. So that's another partnership we hope to expand upon so that we can better tell these stories. And again, the goal of all of us here is to individuate, to humanize, to start really adding nuance and to really get to know these Oregonians that are in these communities and had really important roles. Technology is one of the ways we're doing that as well. This is just one project we've been working on in Southern Oregon. Jin Lin is one of the most well-known and most successful miners in Southern Oregon, of any Chinese or not. And now that we've been able to use this LiDAR 3D scanning of the landscape, we can actually track these like 8-mile ditches and link these ditches to the mining sites that he controlled and operated. And so that allows us to go from just saying Jin Lin was a famous miner to like, here is actually the holdings that he controlled and, the work that he did. And that's a lot of really important information to kind of add, again, more interest and detail to that story. You're going to hear more mining later today by Don Han, also a partner, and this is a very different type of structure that this mining is happening under. It's not like a co-op, this is like a hierarchical business. And again, to show that it's not, the Chinese American experience in Oregon was not monolithic. There's a lot of different things going on. We've been talking a lot about railroads. So I want to show you our railroad. It's no terrace, but this is our artifact is actually a partially completed railroad tunnel. So again, we 3D scanned it, which allows us to take a little tour. Whee! You can see on the bottom, there's wood still remaining. This railroad tunnel was constructed using the heading and bench method. And because it's partially completed, we have a lot more information about the people who did the work, the dangerous work. A lot of times when you talk about railroad construction, all of us that have been doing this work, it can be so hard to find the people in these stories. And so this offers us an opportunity to really bring the people in by seeing decision points and skill and expertise on the ground. That tunnel was left as it was. I think February 8th was the last blast of 1884. The railroad went bust, and it took a while for them to get their act together again, and they changed the route. So literally, as that last blast went, that's how they walked away and left it. What we can see on the left there, those little disco pointy things, that again is that LiDAR laser, and you can't see those pointy things with the naked eye, but those are the drill holes. You can see me pointing to some on the outside. There were hand-drilled holes, and they were using a Burley drill, which was a compressed air drill, to make these holes. And if you have, I think Scott talked about this the other day, that when the tunnels are that big, you start building them from both sides. Well, what do you need to happen? They have to meet in the middle. So that's somebody steering the tunnel to make sure they meet in the middle. And so when you talk again about humanizing the story of something as large and industrial as the railroad, this allows us to, kind of see the human footprint of that story. Working in the Malheur National Forest, let me see if that works. There's Dawn doing some metal detecting out there. Again, more mining sites. So we are recognizing specialized skill. We have a blacksmith shop out there that we've found. We were kind of chasing these modified and repaired tools across the forest, and we were able to we luckily enough found the blacksmith shop. So again, it's a myth of all this unskilled labor. There was a lot of folks that really had a lot of skill and expertise. This is kind of the quiz for everybody. One of the coolest things we found across the forest, and Renee has found some in Idaho as well, in one specific area. When we first found it, I was like, weird little shoehorn, I don't know. Well, it turns out one of the Passport and Time volunteers recognized it as a pick handle support. So this particular area, they were doing a lot of bedrock sluicing, which leads to what one historian called tool abuse. It's so it just would bust up your tools. So somebody, designed this specific type of thing to kind of anchor that pick head on, and we've seen them across two very specific parts of Eastern Oregon and kind of Western Idaho. This is a similar example from Southern Oregon, but it's very distinct. So we're not really sure if we're seeing one blacksmith's work or one kind of vernacular tool style or what. So if anybody knows any more about those pick handle supports, let us know, because we're very interested to see maybe this is the signature of one blacksmith and his work is kind of spreading through these mining areas. They're actually pretty geographically close, and we know folks were moving around. Next, I'm going to, this has been a whirlwind, I know, so I'm kind of winding down, but I'm telling you kind of a little bit about where we're going next. So again, what we want to do when we talk about this history in Oregon is we want to not present it in victim narratives, but we want to always make very clear all the different things that people were navigating as they built these lives across our state. We have this website, and so I was talking with some of our folks involved, and I said, wouldn't it be cool if we could build an interactive timeline so the Chinese immigrant community in Astoria in 1880, you could see what laws, rules, and regulations they'd face, and you could move to John Day in 1910 and see that. Sounded great, but there are too many laws to make it spatially meaningful. And so that in and of itself, I think is really interesting. There's too much data to be able to present it. So this was kind of a beta thing, and we're like, it doesn't work. So what we're now working on is trying to lump things by impact, but we want to have two different things that this will provide. Number one, a comprehensive list of local, state, and federal laws that would have impacted Chinese Americans living in Oregon, as well as the laws that were made by pushing back against those. So for example, we've heard a lot about the Geary Act in here. Well, we've got, this is from the Dalles. This is like them, part of that that resistance, like don't register. So we want to, tie these two kind of things together. So we're still trying to figure out how to tell that story. But again, when my designers came back to me and they said it won't work, I was like, that's so interesting in and of itself, because that speaks to the scale of what folks would have had to navigate in rural Oregon, especially during this time frame. While that's not up on the website, lots more is. This is our website here. You can find it here. All the different places I've taken you on this whirlwind trip today, you can find more. We've designed it so that you can look at just, I want to see a couple pictures, quick take home. You can listen to podcasts, you can watch videos, you can download the archaeological reports. So basically you can get as much or as little information about all this stuff as you want. We also have a lot of resources linked in. And like I mentioned, we're constantly building more stuff that we're adding to it as we go. And I know I'm a little bit over, so thank you all, and I hope to talk to all of you more in the future.
Chelsea, thank you so much. Wow, what wonderful research you're doing. We're all grateful, and the state of Oregon is so lucky to have you doing all that work with all your colleagues. So next we're moving on to Dr. Russell Lowe. I'm going to read the introduction he provided. He received his medical degree from UCSD. He then completed a residency in diagnostic radiology at UC at San Francisco in 1990, followed by a body imaging fellowship at Stanford Medical Center. In a career that spanned over 3 decades, he's become a recognized expert in body MR imaging, who has authored 70 peer-reviewed articles and 11 book chapters. His focus has been defining new MRI techniques for imaging I can't say it, cancer for decades. A frequent guest speaker, Dr. Lowe has given over 300 educational lectures. Skip! I mean, he's got an let's leave it at that. He has an impressive medical career, and but he's brought up those skills to this field, and we're lucky for that too. He's a California-born 4th-generation Chinese-American physician who is a great-grandson of Hung Lei Watt, a transcontinental railroad worker, and Tom Ying, a rescued child slave. The story of his great-grandparents and their descendants has been featured on the History Channel, BBC Radio, National Public Radio, and the Voice of America. It's included in the California State Railroad Museum and the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Russell's passion for research, family history, and storytelling come together in a recently published novel entitled Three Coins. And his books, of course, are in the back. So thank you so much, Russ. I appreciate you being here.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to join you. And I have a story that fits perfectly with Chelsea's presentation. I'm going to humanize the people, the diaspora in Oregon, to the max. So I'm going to present to you what took me 3 decades to uncover. But it's basically the story, not just my family, but it's the story of their interaction in Oregon with the surrounding community. And I think you're going to find this engaging, potentially surprising, and I think uplifting. So thank you.
Today's presentation celebrates diversity and is a new narrative about the Chinese experience in America. In the 1800s, one community in the Pacific Northwest saw beyond their differences to embrace their common humanity. The resultant acceptance for these families set in motion ripples that have impacted lives of Americans across generations and decades. This is their story. Now, my grandmother Kay passed away in 1974, almost half a century after her husband, Hop Lee or Lo Sun Fook, died in 1925. After she passed away, the aunts, uncles, and cousins descended upon her home and took away the heirlooms. 2 decades later, one of these boxes mysteriously arrived on my doorstep. At the bottom of this cardboard box where I encountered the true treasures. I assumed that this had to be written by my grandfather, Lo Sun Fook. I sent this to my friend, Phil Choi, and they discovered that indeed that was correct. This was the journal of Lo Sun Fook. And he writes in it that I am Lo Sun Fook, born in the Chinese year 4556 or 1858 in Guangdong Province, Toishin, Hoyin, in the village of Hachunchong. I am Lo Sai Wing's son and Lo Man Bing's grandson. Now, it was probably 10 or 15 years later that I came across this document. And Lily said, Russell, this is your family's fortune teller scroll. But as she read it, not knowing anything about my grandfather's story, she told in eerie detail all of the details of his life and the things that are about to happen. Well, what eventually revealed itself was a multicultural story. The tale involves an Nez Perce warrior, a Chinese laundryman turned hop rancher, and a white newspaperman, as well as bankers. 140 years ago, their lives intersected in a remarkable way on the streets of Salem. He is indeed Lo Sun Fook. His married name is Lo Yao Hing, although the people of Salem and you and I will come to know him as Hop Lee. He was born on December 12, 1858 in Hachunchong village. Truly on the coast of southern China in Toishan, and that proximity to the water made these people fishermen and explorers, which is going to explain a lot about their genetic material. Their goal, their dream is to come to America. And to meet that end, in 1877, they went to Hong Kong. They went to Connaught Road, and they joined up with the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to begin the 7,000-mile journey to America. Now, their eventual goal will be to get to not San Francisco, but to get to the Pacific Northwest. In 1860, there were 421 Chinese in Oregon. Now, a decade later, that number had exploded to 3,300 Chinese. And later in 1880, there were now 9,500. However, to put this into perspective, this is really dwarfed by the number of Chinese that were in California. In 1880, there were 50,000 Chinese in California. There were 22,000 Chinese just in the town of San Francisco. And I think this difference in terms of the size of the Chinese population played quite prominently in terms of the reaction and the response of the white community in San Francisco and Salem to these Chinese immigrants. Whereas Lo Sun Fook will be in Albany for a while. He'll learn the laundry trade and eventually make his way up to Salem, Oregon, where the story is really going to take off. Both boys immigrated together. Lo Sun Fook has this journal, and he's making the very first entry. As he's about to get off the boat, he very hurriedly writes the last line, which is, I wish to be an American. And that dream to be an American, to be a citizen, to be able to vote, was something which drove Hop Lee and the other Chinese really for the next 4 decades. They really strove and wanted to become American, but as you're going to see, they're going to face tremendous anti-Chinese attitudes and certainly anti-Chinese laws, which are going to constrain their journey for some time. The census in Albion, Oregon shows that there was a Chinese wash house, and intriguingly, he's probably this young man. He's 23 years of age, his birth is about 1857, and he's listed as one Chinaman in this household of Chinese laundrymen in there. By 1884, Lo Sun Fook, Hopley as he'll be called, eventually made his way up to Salem, Oregon. He arrives on the Wells Fargo stagecoach with Uncle Sing and Tom Reynolds. This is what it looked like. Now in Salem, the number of Chinese was really variable. And I think if you just look at the census, there aren't really that many. 1862, a decade later, 24, 1880, 89. By 1900, 1910, you have 125. You can see, however, that the number of women clearly was very, very small. Women were very uncommon in Salem and in other Chinatowns. Hopley opened his first laundry on South Commercial Street, the Rector Building. And this was really a pioneer building. It served Salem as its first city hall. However, by the time Hopley arrived, it was a laundry house. You can see that it's made of wood, which is going to figure prominently in terms of what happens next. It was evident at once that the fire was a hot one. The horse-drawn steamer was stationed at the Chemekta cistern, and within minutes, 4 streams of water were playing on the flames. The Rector building burned to the ground, destroying the Hopley laundry. It was a total loss. Later that night, Hopley sat down with his journal and wrote his thoughts. There was a big fire tonight. Hopley wash is a total loss, but do not despair. Tonight will be a new beginning, and I will become a successful American businessman. Hopley opened his laundry at 191 South Commercial Street, just south of the Brick Smith building. This building contained the post office, the Women's Temperance Union, and the Capital Journal newspaper. This beautiful painting by my friend Mia Situ shows what the inside of Hopley's laundry might have looked like in the 1880s. Hopley was not content to be just a Chinese laundryman. He wanted to become an American. In fact, his dream was to be an American statesman. Hop's interactions with his white businessman friends shaped his life, and the interactions with the Chinese fostered a unique friendship that persisted for decades. Otto Wilson, of course, opened the first Oldsmobile dealership in 1907. R.J. Hendricks bought the Oregon Statesman in 1884. And the Hoffer brothers took over the Capital Journal in January of 1890 as editor and manager. Many of these young men arrived in Salem in the 1880s at about the same time as Hopley and the Chinese. The relationship between these young Chinese and these young white businessmen really set the course for what was about to happen in Salem over the next several decades. The Chinese became hop farmers as early as 1889. About 3 years later, Hopley followed him when he leased 60 acres from Ed Dove, 5 miles west of Salem along the Willamette River. On August 27, 1897, Hop is advertising for 100 pickers to go out to the Ed Dove yard in Polk County, and they are instructed to go to the Hopley Laundry on Commercial Street to register hundreds. However, it's really important to understand the historical, social, and the political context of what's going on in America at that time. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a time of horrendous anti-Chinese laws and attitudes. The anti-Chinese movement was also taking place in Oregon, and during this period, the Chinese were greatly abused and threatened. Violence against the Chinese in Portland came to a climax in 1886 when whites took it upon themselves to evict the Chinese. 30 armed white men stormed a camp of 180 Chinese laborers, ordering them to leave the state. On November 3, 1885, the good citizens of Tacoma forcibly expelled their Chinese residents. A mob that consisted of prominent businessmen and politicians descended on the Chinese community. They were armed and they forcibly broke into houses, smashing in doors and breaking windows. They marched the Chinese residents to a railroad station, forced them to board a train headed for Portland, and then the good citizens returned to Chinatown and burned it to the ground. This became known across the country as the Tacoma Method. In 1886, the anti-Chinese riots spilled over to Seattle. On February 6 to 8, a mob of the Knights of Labor forcibly expelled the Chinese. There was violence. 200 Chinese citizens were forced to leave the city. When word reached Salem's Chinese quarter, they were all on edge. They anticipated their fate, and they waited. Now, what happened in Salem was quite remarkable, because from what I can tell, there were no recorded anti-Chinese activities or meetings, there were no riots, there was no arson, there were no murders, and there were certainly no forced removals. And the question is why? We have the community and the social experiment where we have the Chinese men like George Lai Hopley and Dr. Lai Yik, and white businessmen and newspaper publishers like R.J. Hendricks and Ernst Hoffer, who developed an interesting relationship. But Hop's circle of friends includes newspaper publishers, bank presidents, politicians, businessmen, hop growers, U.S. senators, Supreme Court justices, and chicken farmers. I think it's time perhaps for a new narrative on the Chinese experience, at least in Salem. Will Carver stated it in the Oregon Statesman when he wrote that this is a story of loyalty and sacrifice and the creation of lasting and unwavering friendship between the Oriental and Occidental, the yellow and the white. The Chinese in Salem, Oregon were not isolated foreigners who were feared and despised by the white citizens of Salem. Rather, these Chinese in Salem were, or at least became, friends and neighbors. Their children attended the same Salem schools, universities, and churches, with a true fondness between the Chinese and the Salem community. This relationship, which began with these young men in the 1880s and earlier, continued for half a century. So while the rest of the country was driving out the Chinese, forcibly expelling them, putting them onto boats and sending them away, in Salem, they were having parties together. Chinese love to party, and there is no bigger celebration than Chinese New Year. As early as 1885, the sound of firecrackers filled the streets of Salem's Chinese Quarter, celebrating the New Year. Now, initially, the celebration was only for the Chinese. However, in the 1890s, something remarkable happened in Salem. Salem merchant An Lee reported that the young ladies and gentlemen of Salem had come calling at his Chinese store, showing a marked and intelligent appreciation of the curious and beautiful decorations and arrangements and sweet treats. He noted a vast difference in how the Chinese were treated today compared to 23 years ago when he arrived in Salem. In 1922, Dr. Yik Lai hosted a dinner party for 25 Salem residents at his Nam King Cafe. His guest list included Hal Patton, Governor Ben Alcott, and Judge John McCourt. Judge John McCourt paid high tribute to the Chinese. Banker Walton stated that the Chinese bankers are among the best in the world. Chief of Police Moffat stated that there would be little need for a police department if all the citizens were as law-abiding as the Chinese. After living as a bachelor in Salem for a quarter of a century, Hop has a plan. He needs to put down roots, and he also wants to buy property. Fortunately, he has one in mind, which was again predicted by the fortune. The fortune said that a little bird of happiness will fly up from the south. This little bird of happiness turns out to be the oldest daughter of a yin of 3 coins. As early as October 1903, Ernst Hoffer, the Capital Journal, is covering the marriage of his friend Hop Lee, stating that his many friends have been congratulating him, and he is the best known and most popular Chinaman in the capital city. The following December of 1904, Ernst Hoffer again covered the baptism of Kay's first child, Elsie. Hop Lee, who had lived as a lonely bachelor for 25 years, finally had a family. He was no longer just a willow tree, he was now a willow forest. You may recall that Hop wanted to purchase property. And between 1904 and 1914, Hop fulfilled his American dream, acquiring 7 hop farms in the incredibly fertile Willamette Valley, where Hop could never purchase land as a Chinese. His wife, born in San Francisco, most certainly could. And Kay, also known as Hung Hop Lee, became the youngest landowner in the state of Oregon. These wonderful photographs I found in my grandmother's album. They show beautiful images of life on the Phuoc Chong Ranch in the early 1900s. By 1916, Hop had moved his family again at 125 13th Street, which was at the corner of 13th and State. The Hopleys are now neighbors with the governor of Oregon. They're also next door to Willamette University, Hop Lee's second favorite institution. Ultimately, this story is about Hopley the man and his relationship with the community of Salem, Oregon. Lo Sun Fuk the man was an educated scholar who, as a young man in China, studied the classical teachings of Confucius. He came to believe in and to practice the principles of family, integrity, dignity, and decency. These are the principles which transcend differences in culture, race, and classes. He was, in essence, a gentleman from China. Hopley and the other Chinese were well liked by the citizens of Salem, in spite of his strange attire and pigtails. 140 years ago, these Chinese and the citizens of Salem taught each other that character is what matters in life, not one's appearance. Salem, Oregon at the turn of the 20th century was a rare oasis, an island of acceptance and mutual respect, of trust between different races and cultures, as the Chinese and Salem citizens discovered over 100 years ago. We are all connected and we are all human.
Would you like to say a few words?
You want to take questions now, or?
I think we'll do it at the end.
Good.
We'll have them all.
Let's do that.
Thank you, though. Well, that was fabulous, and what a great storyteller he is, right? Thank you so much. That was, and your technical skills as a doctor come forward in your technical filmmaking too. So thank you. Okay, so next, our last one, and thank you everybody so much on time. We're going to have some time for some discussion. So, our last speaker in this session is Karen Leong. Oh, I'm so sorry. I appreciate you telling me I was not loud enough. Karen Leong is Associate Professor of History at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where she researches and teaches about intersections of gender, race, class, and citizenship in the U.S. West, Asian American history, and women of color feminisms. She's presenting this work as part of a collaboration with the Silver City Museum to recover the history of Chinese in Silver City and Grant County, New Mexico. She's a member of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance Lodge in Albuquerque. As a newcomer to New Mexico, she looks forward to continuing her research about Asian Americans' experiences in relation to the complex multi-ethnic history of New Mexico. She is author of The China Mystique, Pearl Buck, Mailing Sun Chiang, Anime Wong, and the Transformation of American Oriental. Sorry, that was the title of the work. And co-editor of special issues of Journal of Asian American Studies in Amerasia, and co-author of Women's Sexual and Reproductive Health, Recognition, Equity, and AANHP is forthcoming with Routledge Press. So thank you so much, Karen, for being here, and please talk to us.
Thank you so much. I wanted to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes who continue to fight for their sovereignty and dignity. I hope our efforts for recognition will extend the recognition value we seek to others who also have been denied historically and systemically in our society. So my presentation, and I want to thank everyone who've organized the conference and also who presented, because I've learned so much from just listening, and it's been really inspiring. My presentation discusses the unexpected communities I discovered when starting research about Chinese settlers in Silver City, New Mexico. I apologize, I'm recovering from a respiratory infection, so that's why I'm wearing a mask, and why I might be short of breath. As you can see in this picture, this is a timber house in Silver City. There's a Chinese man at the very far right. He is not identified in the picture. With many of the pictures in Silver City that do show Chinese servants, cooks, they are not identified. They're just like part of the scenery. And so Silver City, New Mexico, the museum, Martin Vaselli, the director, contacted me, and they wanted to rectify this and really start addressing the Chinese contributions to Silver City. And so I started this research in December of last year, and I wrote a book chapter for an upcoming anthology by the invitation of Bart Vaselli. I'm sorry they're not here because I think they would have really enjoyed it too. So I had to learn where Silver City was. It was founded in 1878. The first Chinese arrived in 1874. It's part of Grant County and is located in the southwestern part of the state. As the name suggests, it was a site of mining initially for silver, which was when it was under the Mexican government. As the U.S. Gradually took over the territory, it became an important source of copper ore, and it still has a copper mine today. Today, the population is under 9,500 persons, with less than 1% of Asian descent. The first unexpected community I encountered was that those of present-day Silver City residents who volunteered and support the museum. Here you see Javier. On the right, you see Javier Marufo, who is the new curator, and he's been doing work on the Mexican inhabitants, who are many in Silver City. You see Bart Oselli, the director. In the middle is Rural Chinatowns, who is the president of the board of the museum. And then Susan Berry is the past director of the museum, and she is an architectural scholar, and she's an amazing genealogist. And at the very top, they found this Golden Gate grocery store sign, and it was in the shed of what they knew of, that was on the lands of what they know of as the Chinese Gardens. And the Chinese Gardens have been there for since the 1800s. And that is one of the sites. And I'm realizing how important archaeology is to really uncovering both the railroad workers and their traces, and also the unnamed Chinese workers who worked in the gardens, because we know they exist, but we don't really have any documentation about them. And one of the things Susan Berry did, she was friends with the Lim family, and the Chinese gardens became known as the Golden Gardens, and they were owned by Ma Fun Lim. He married Sue Liu of the Liu family that ran the Deming Gardens, Chinese gardens, which were huge. They had a tower, and people would actually picnic, and you just see in the upper right-hand corner, that's a picture. They had postcards, and people would like bring their picnics and sit by the lagoon where there were fish. It was beautiful, and they would like have picnics there. So it was this amazing sight, and both of the gardens, importantly, are built near the ends of the railroads that probably the Chinese workers worked on. And this collection that she got from the family is so important, not just because it united these two prominent families in Grant County, but because it also talks about the intergenerational relationships. You'd be surprised at how few research is about Chinese American intergenerational relationships and the experience of the second generation Chinese Americans. There's nothing about growing up that I know of, research about Chinese Americans growing up in rural Chinatowns and their experiences. But in the far corner, you see Olive, the youngest daughter, who was very involved with her high school in the 1950s and 60s. And then you see Ma Fun's draft card. There, another surprise that I found was,
Could you speak into the mic, please?
Oh.
The mic over to you.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. And so we're trying to get money. Ashley Smith has just written a grant from New Mexico, grants from the state to process the collection, because it's such a valuable and rare family personal collection about the family and the intergenerations of the children as well growing up in Silver City. This slide shows the importance of the Grant County records that I relied on, and it shows that this borderland area at the Mexico border, and shows another unexpected community of intermarriage between Chinese who were born in Mexico and Chinese who were born and it shows that there is Chinese who came across the border from Mexico and settled in Silver City, and they married. And we also see that Chinese, and they lived with some of the Chihuahua families who were mostly Mexican, but I found one Chinese person who lived in that community and had a Spanish or Mexican name. And so those are more things to explore. We also know that because of the miscegenation laws in Arizona, They were removed and then they came back after the Civil War when Reconstruction failed. We see that Arizona repassed their miscegenation law in 1865, and New Mexico never reinstated their miscegenation law. So these are just some of the examples of interracial couples who married in Lordsburg, Grant County, New Mexico, because it was allowed and Arizona would recognize marriages in other states, even though they wouldn't perform them themselves. And at the time, Mexicans were considered white. I mean, they still are, according to the census. And so this was actually considered illegal, these marriages in many states, but not in New Mexico. And what's interesting to me again is that you see Donatilla Rodriguez was born in Canton, China. Joe Yun was born in Sinaloa, Mexico. And so these fascinating border crossings that you see in some of these marriage records. I call this Raul's archive. I showed you Raul Torieta. He's one of my heroes. I mean, when the Grant County City Hall moved in the 1970s and 80s, the basement was full of records and they were just sitting there. He found out about them and he bought a container, and that's the container behind the Grant County offices, and he in his truck picked up like over 100 ledgers, and they're very heavy, from the 1870s to the 1980s. And without these records, we would have lost records of the Chinese businesses and other businesses. And many of the reasons we know that they were Chinese is because of the businesses that had Chinese names. We don't know the names of the owners because the assessors only kept track of the business names, and the censuses they avoided. We know that the Chinese were avoiding censuses as well, since many of them were actually paper or didn't have their documentation. Right here on the one side, you see the 1893 ledger that Sam Lee owned his own property, which is very rare for a Chinese merchant. They usually rented, and he had $300 worth of personal property. Then with the Lim family that I talked about that that united the two gardens, they ran a Manhattan cafe. They rented their property, but they had $1,000 worth of property there at the restaurant in 1952, which was really high at the time. And then finally, I think the most important thing that I was so surprised about, and this sort of follows what Russell found as well, is that on February 14th, 1885, a week after events in Eureka, California, the small mining camp of Malone that was only founded in 1882 and therefore was made of newcomers, created a protective association and would not allow Chinese to set up business in that town. No other anti-Chinese organizations emerged until late November 1885 after Rock Springs and Tacoma events. On December 1st, the Silver City's newly formed Friends of the Order of Labor Society held their first open town meeting about expelling Chinese. The proposal was that they would give them one day, they'd all have to leave. Any merchant who had more than $1,000 worth of property would be given an additional month to leave, but they would have to leave. And what I was so surprised about was the response of the town leaders. Dr. Thatcher said, well, why don't we just make an exception for those who've lived here for 2 years if they can stay? Judge Bennett suggested that all Chinese be encouraged to register their intent for citizenship. And this is after exclusion, when we know that they weren't eligible for citizenship. A Judge Jin tried to voice his objections and he was shouted down. John Wright, who was respected by both sides enough to be elected chair of the meeting, warned against extra-legal violence. He said, no one should do this. We should allow the law to take its course. The city and county officers will oppose any violence and might even call on the army to assist. And before the meeting broke up, the sheriff spoke up, Sheriff Woods. This is a quote. He spoke a word of warning to those present, advising them that at the first violent attempt to make a Chinaman leave town, he would arrest those taking part in it and place them in jail. And this just was not what I expected given the histories of other Western cities and states. And so I think it's a really important point to make. And again, it follows what Russell has found in Salem. And what's so interesting too is that the subsequent tensions that occurred were not between whites and non-whites, but between the white residents themselves. Businessmen were punching each other in the streets. People were disagreeing. Even people who were anti-Chinese boycotted the boycott of the Chinese businesses or businesses that hired Chinese. They said there's such a shortage of labor. How can we punish businesses that rely on the reliable labor that Chinese provide? By and large, the threats ended by mid-January, and the secret society appears to have lost its bluster. And the Chinese residents also were not silent. And this echoes what Chelsea Rose pointed out. Of the 79 Chinese residents reported in the papers out of 3,000 citizens in September 1885, 32 men filed declarations to become naturalized citizens of the United States between December 1886 and July 23rd, December 1885 and July 1886. 2/3 filed these declarations in December as a part of a coordinated response protest of Chinese across the United States against immigration restrictions. During the same month, over 200 Chinese in El Paso filed their intent to naturalize. After the 1888 Scott Act, several Silver City Chinese practiced the politics of respectability. Newspapers reported that they suddenly began attending English language classes and Sunday school offered by the local Methodist church. What do we make of this? Well, we know that class undoubtedly contributed to the town leaders' responses. Race doesn't occur in a vacuum. The rough character of the working class whites were disparaged in the newspapers, their incivility, their violence. The town leaders were much more concerned about the whites who were leading the boycott as being rough and violent. They called for legal and civil responses to the Chinese question. But equally important, I think, is the specific regional context. In the same papers that reported about the Chinese question, the military was reporting daily reports of Apache raiding local settlements, bands of warriors. They were unfairly characterized, I think, because, after all, Silver City was started on the site of an Apache camp. They were continually tracked by the U.S. military, and warnings were continually in every paper about being aware of these Apaches. The ongoing presence of Mexican migrants, black settlers, and Indians seeking to reclaim their territories created a very complicated context that helps understand perhaps why the Chinese were favored, why they were supported in southwestern New Mexico. I just wanted to note that Zach also in his slide talked about racial triangulation, which is so important to understand the complexity of what can happen in the face of multiracial communities. Focusing only on the Chinese settlers without understanding the larger social context can overlook the key way that race intersects with other factors and continues to shape who belongs and who does not. Finally, even though the 1882 law supposedly restricted Chinese from naturalized citizenship, Beth Lou Williams has noted that over 8,000 naturalized Chinese Americans were listed in the 1900 U.S. Census from all classes and occupations. Of the 32 Chinese from Grant County who declared their intent to naturalize, only 2 received citizenship. I was shocked that they received it at all. Lu San, who I showed the ledger, he received his citizenship in April 1892. Toy, a longtime resident of Sierra, received their citizenship. I think she was a female. She's listed as a woman in June 1891. Moreover, Silver City newspapers seemed to delight in asserting Sam's U.S. citizenship. Again, much like what Russell noted. The Eagle, for example, observed that since his naturalization, quote, Sam has proudly claimed the rights of citizenship, never failing to vote at a party primary or election, and served his country in the jury box. This seems to suggest, for at least for certain parts of the town, Sam enjoyed substantive citizenship in ways that many residents of Silver City, whites, blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese, did not. As argued by others, the act of declaring an intent to become a naturalized citizen, even in the face of a law stating otherwise, is a form of resurgent citizenship, demanding the rights of democracy in the face of attempts to exclude. But Sam was an exception. He spoke English fluently, was a successful businessman who cultivated his relationships with town leaders, and was trusted enough to be an interpreter for immigration officials enforcing the Gary Act. In fact, Sam was particularly keen to also ensure his son's rights of citizenship, not his three daughters, listed in the district courts. And this is a picture of his statement. I don't know if I have time to read it. I do? Okay, thanks. And he says, "To all whom it may concern, greetings. I, Lou Sam, a citizen and resident of the County of Grant and Territory of New Mexico, do hereby certify that by birth I am a native of the Empire of China, and that on the 11th day of April, AD 1892, I was duly and fully naturalized as a citizen of the United States of America, and received my final certificate, therefore, in the District Court of America, in the District Court, blah, 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 sitting in and for the County of Grant, and that I had at the time of receiving said certificate resided in the United States for a period of 21 years. And furthermore, that subsequent to my said naturalization, I was married to a Mexican woman, who is now my wife, and subsequently to wit, on March 22nd, AD 1902, there was born to myself and my wife, Sable Sam, a son who has been Christian Yuan Boy Sam, who is still living at Silver City, Grant County, New Mexico, his place of birth." His assertive declaration is remarkable for at least two reasons. First, he applied for and received citizenship even during the restriction era of 1882. And he received it in 1892, 10 years after the 1882 Restrictive Act. Second, he returned to the courthouse on each occasion of his son's birth to certify that they were native born in Silver City. He made sure to read it in writing his own naturalization, his lawful marriage, and his son's birthright U.S. citizenship. This paper trail indicates Sam's acute awareness that his presence in the United States was subject to ongoing surveillance and might revoke at any moment. Boo Williams reminds us, quote, "Naturalized Chinese always face the possibility of denaturalization, and with denaturalization came the threat of disenfranchisement, deportation, and exclusion. Nonetheless, we cannot ignore how he is empowered, spoke out, and claimed his rights."